So in the previous lesson, what we did was take an introduction to the concept of causation for the law of tort. And we just basically introduced the idea of causation. We noted that it is delineated between the idea of causation in fact as well as causation in law. And then we also explained the elements of causation as it related to the tort of negligence. Now in this video, we're going to really examine what is arguably the most important part of the test for establishing causation between the breach of a duty of care and the damage that is established as a result of that breach. And this is something known as the ButFor Test. Like I mentioned, we looked briefly in the last lesson at the subject of causation, and essentially the next major topic in our series on the law of tort. We're going to be covering causation for the next few lessons. This lesson is examining, as I've mentioned, the first major principle of the concept of causation, which is the ButFor Test. Now, the ButFor Test is quite easy to understand, really. Essentially, the ButFor Test is a hypothetical test, and it is a hypothetical experiment, if you will, a thought experiment that you have to do in consideration of the facts of a particular case. And it essentially asks us to ask the question, really, the impact and the extent to which the actions that were ascribed to the defendant were impactful to such an extent as to be able to cause the tortious event that leads to the damage to the claimant. So it assumes that, first of all, we're assuming that there is a breach of a duty of care. And the ButFor Test simply asks us to consider the question, but for the actions of the defendant, would the damage have occurred? That's essentially the gist of the ButFor Test in terms of its basic descriptive elements. We're essentially asking the question, if the actions of the defendant had not have happened, if the defendant had not have breached a duty of care, would the damage that was caused to the claimant still have occurred? If the answer is no, if the damage didn't and wouldn't have occurred if there wasn't a breach of a duty of care, then this would satisfy the ButFor Test and establish causation in fact. If it would be the case, if it's the case that even if the defendant did not breach a duty of care, the damage that was caused to a claimant would have still taken place, this would suggest that there were other factors which contributed to the cause of the damage, and so as a result of which we would not satisfy causation in fact as a result. Now, to illustrate this point, let's have a look at a piece of case law. We can talk about the 1969 case of Burnett and Chelsea Hospital. Now, this was a case where there were a number of claimants who had brought a claim on the basis that they had become ill or as the result of drinking some tea. It was later found that they had suffered from arsenic poisoning, leading at least one of them to have died. In the process, they went to the hospital, but they were turned away. So they had become ill as a result of drinking some tea. As it turned out, there was arsenic in the tea, which is obviously not very good. It's a toxic to humans, at least arsenic is. And one of them dies, and when we talk about what had happened in terms of the events, they had gone to the hospital complaining about the fact that they were ill as the result of drinking this tea, and the hospital had said, well, we're going to turn you away. For whatever reason, maybe they didn't believe that the illness was sufficiently serious to merit being hospitalized, or whether or not they had enough space to hospitalize these people. Regardless, whatever was the reason, the hospital had turned them away. The question here was whether or not the failure on the part of the doctors to see the claimants had been the cause of the death. So the question here is essentially they had gone to the hospital, they had been turned away, and one of them died. Okay. Now the question here is for causation to be established. So, but for the turning of the claimants away from the hospital, would the damage still have occurred? So essentially, if it wasn't for the fact that the hospital had turned them away, would the claimant have still died? That is the question that we're asking here. So was it the failure of the doctors to see the claimant, was that the cause of the death? If they had have not been turned away, would they have still died? It was found that on the balance of probabilities, and owing to the amount of arsenic that was consumed and the severity of the poisoning, it would have been very likely that the patient would have died regardless of treatment that a doctor had given them. So even if they had gone to the hospital, they had been hospitalized, a doctor would have seen them, even if the doctor would have known that it was arsenic poisoning and prescribed the relevant the relevant treatments, it is still, on the balance of probabilities, it was found that they would have still probably died as a result of the consumption of this poison. And so, in application of the ButFor test, the cause of the death was not the doctors failing to see the patients. It was not the doctors negligently failing to see the patients. It was the arsenic poisoning that would have caused the death, regardless of, even if the doctors had not have been negligent or had not have breached a standard of care. Where there is a question of causation, there is an evidential burden that is going to be placed on the claimant to prove that the actions of the defendant had been the cause of the harm, and that but for the actions of the defendant, the claimant would have not suffered any kind of damage. So in terms of the evidential burden, the burden of responsibility, the burden of proof for causation questions, that rests solely on that of the claimant. And that makes sense for a basic understanding of natural justice, given the fact that you wouldn't assume that the actions of a defendant caused the damage to the claimant, and then it is up for the defendant to rebut that assumption. It is in the sense that you are proving a positive rather than trying to disprove a negative.